Immediately after I say these last two words, Arka casts a spell that makes it sound like she's slowly clapping her hands. Bravo, Arka says, with the sound of clapping can still be heard in the background. Bravo! Of the hundreds of people I've asked this question to in the past, you and Illuna were the only ones to have answered it correctly so quickly. When I suppose Flower figured it out on her own too, but I never really bothered to ask her the question, so it doesn't count. You asked this question to hundreds of people, I say, but to whom? Banshees mostly, Araka says. There was a time in the past where I may have had a slight feeling of guilt regarding the expulsion of female spirits from the magical plane. A very tiny, almost insignificant sense of guilt, mind you, but still guilt nonetheless. This is why I've spent the first few days after my banishment 5,000 years ago teaching several of the older and wiser female spirits how to absorb souls in order to survive on this plane of existence. At first they refused, but of course once it became clear to them that they had no way to survive in this world without acquiring an earthen body, most of them reluctantly agreed to use my technique, while the older spirits then took it upon themselves to teach the soul absorption technique to as many banished spirits as they could find. And so the first generation of banshees were formed. I'm not sure how many of those first ones are still alive to this day, but I wouldn't be surprised if at least a few of them were still around. Otherwise, I don't see how the Banshee working for the Northern Sage would have been able to find out about me and my initial role in the banishment of all female spirits. But why are you teaching me how to absorb souls? I asked Araka. What purpose could you possibly have for doing such a thing? Why don't you try answering that question yourself, Barry boy? Araka says, what do you think is my purpose for teaching you about this spell? The only thing I can think of off the top of my head would be that he could absorb his ethereal plane self, and then that connection would be stronger, and then he could use magic maybe. I think you want me to absorb your soul and steal all your powers. I think you want me to absorb your technique. Use your technique to absorb the Magium. That's fucking crazy. I'm getting the feeling that the soul absorption is not the thing you want to teach me. Yeah, the first one is stupid. The second one sounds crazy. Third one, only one is kinda understandable. I get the feeling the soul absorption is not the thing you want to teach me. Precisely, Araka says. Now tell me, was there anything else that you noticed while I was casting that spell? Anything at all? I say. Now they mentioned it, there was something else I had noticed when you used your soul absorption technique earlier. You aimed it at the empty air in front of your amulet, correct? Araka says, but the air doesn't have a soul, I say. Go on, Araka says. Normally a spell made with a very specific purpose like yours shouldn't be able to activate if it does not find an appropriate target, I say. If you were trying to daze a rock or put it to sleep, it would be impossible because the rock isn't alive. Using the same logic, your spell should also cancel itself before being cast. If you do not target it at someone who has a soul in the ethereal plane, since your spell worked even under these conditions, it means that the design of the spell is fundamentally different from the vast majority of spells that are being used by today's mages. The underlying principles behind the spell could potentially lay the foundation for a completely new branch of magic. They already did, Araka says. Come again? I ask her confused. I did form a new branch of magic based on the underlying principles of this one spell. Araka says, I did it many thousands of years ago, back when I was still in the magical plane, and when designing new spells used to be a lot easier and faster than it is now. It used to be easier back then? Yeah, why would that be the case, I say, but why? Who knows, Araka says. Maybe it's because less time had passed since the primordial plane got split into three and the new planes of existence have been fully stabilized yet. Either way, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that I alone have access to these spells. I'm planning to spend the next few days or weeks teaching them to you. Well, that's certainly generous of you, I say. What's the catch? There's no catch, Araka says. I would have taught them to you earlier, but you have no way of casting magic, so it would have ended up being a waste of time. Yeah, we can only cast magic even now in the ethereal plane. Now at least you can cast spells on the ethereal plane, so there is some progress to be made. We've been practicing all sorts of spells in the ethereal plane for the past few days, with Flower and Luna's help, right? But now you can add these new spell of mine to the list. I'm not sure if that's how it works, I say. As far as I understand, there is no real magic in the ethereal plane. The only reason why I can cast spells there is because people know about them, and so the ideas behind those spells can reach that plane of existence. If you're going to give me some secret spell that only you know about, I don't think I'll be able to cast them. It'll work, don't worry, Araka says. As long as the root of the spell is correctly imprinted into the tapestry, you'll be able to... What's the tapestry again? You will be able to cast it no matter which plane you're on. I'm sorry, I tell her. Imprinted on the what? The tapestry, Arka says. That's what we call it on the magical plane. I'm not sure if you have an equivalent word for it on the earthen plane, or if your people even know about it, but it's the place where all spells are defined. You know how most spells have certain rules and limitations, right? Well, the tapestry is the place where these rules are imprinted. When the spells are first created, every mage can access it subconsciously. Although it takes a great deal of skill to find a spell in it that you don't already know about from somewhere else. Normally you should also have access to the tapestry when you had the opportunity to use your magical stats. Now that you mention it, what you say does sound somewhat familiar, I tell Araka. I always did figure that the spells must be coming from somewhere on the magical plane, but never stopped to think about how it worked until now. The tapestry is not on the magical plane, or on any other plane for that matter, Araka says. It's one of the few remnants from the days when all three planes of existence were still, I still don't understand what the three existence of plane is. There is the ethereal, there's the ethereal plane, the magical plane, and the mortal plane. Okay, never mind. Just like the auras, it is one of the few remnants from the days when all the three planes of existence were still united, just like the auras and the primordial spells. Right, I say. So basically, what you're saying is that if I switch my consciousness to the ethereal plane right now, I should be able to cast the soul absorption spell of yours. No, not the soul absorption spell, Araka says. I only showed that to you so you can understand the basic principles behind it. Even the crude version of that spell that I taught to the banshees will be too difficult for you to understand since you're not a magical spirit that can learn these things intuitively. However, I do have a few spells in mind that will be particularly useful against the God of Time, and against that sad copy of me from the parallel universe that we were sent to during the ritual. But what about the Aiden, I say? I don't know, Arka says. What about him? You fought him before, didn't you? I ask her, surely you must know some of his weaknesses, or at least a few of the loopholes that he used to defeat you. His loopholes, as you call them, were largely irrelevant on their own, Araka says. The first time when I fought Aiden during the Stillwinter, he was barely comparable to one of the low-tier gods that I massacred on the magical plane when I went on my initial rampage. Sure, he had a ridiculous amount of magical power, and his inventive ways of bypassing the rules of spells was rather impressive, but those were not the kind of tricks that I was complaining about when I told you before about my fight against him. They're not? I said, then what? Like I was saying, in my first battle against Aiden, I bested him easily, Araka says. I would have killed him too if that idiot Stillwater theorist hadn't stopped me, giving the Golden Fox enough time to swoop in and teleport Aiden away from danger. How exactly did the Stillwater that you were fused with stop you, I say? Didn't you say before that he was supposed to be a weakling? He was a weakling compared to myself or Aiden, but he was still stronger than every other Stillwater in that war, and he was also an ethereal, Araka says. The problem with ethereals is that their power gets multiplied exponentially while you fight them on the ethereal plane, especially inside their own mind. The ethereals may have been weaker than me on the earthen plane, but in the ethereal plane, he was just strong enough to force a stalemate against me when I invaded his mind, and to cause our souls to fuse instead of letting me absorb him. In practice, this meant that the two of us were forced to live inside his mind together for the duration of the Stillwinter. I still don't know what the Stillwinters, how are they born exactly. In practice, this meant that the two of us were forced to live inside his mind together for the duration of the Stillwinter, just like Flower and Luna are doing now. Being of equal strength to me on that plane of existence, Therios was able to interfere with me on multiple occasions, including the one time when he saved Aiden from being killed because they were apparently friends or something. Not that their friendship really amounted to much when this old pal Aiden came back to murder us both, of course. So how did Aiden manage to beat you the second time? Then I asked. Was it because he got help from the fox? He got a lot more help than just from the golden fox, Araka says. The second time when I fought Aiden, it was like I was facing a completely different person. He wasn't just using just loopholes anymore. He was essentially completely rewriting the rules of magic in increasingly more ridiculous ways all throughout the fight. It was an extremely frustrating experience, especially for someone as well learned in the arts of magic such as myself. Are you sure that he wasn't just using the loopholes that you didn't know about at the time, I say? Of course I'm sure, Araka says. Half of the things that he was doing in that fight were literally impossible. I'm honestly surprised that I even lasted as long as I did, considering how stupidly unfair that whole battle was. But if what you're telling me is true and Aiden had really bent the laws of magic for real, how could anyone hope to ever defeat him in his current state, I say? I said that he could bend laws of magic at will, not that he still can, Araka says. At this point of time, he probably only had access to a very small selection of tricks compared to what he had during his last fight against me. My theory has always been that his unparalleled magical knowledge during that fight somehow came from the Magium, but more recently, after having seen how a Magium fragment possessed the Overseer and almost undid our whole universe in an attempt to hunt down the other Araka, I think I might have finally figured out what happened to all these years ago.